Hello, hello. We have Brittany Rogers coming again. The spring light is crazy, but I need it. So, it's like zombie eyes. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
It's close to me today. Ugh. All right. Thank you for coming again on this lovely Wednesday evening.
No problem.
So last week, for everyone, if you didn't see, this is Brittany Rogers. We spoke about like who you are and what you do. You have Be the Change services. You just dropped your book, The Things I Wish I Knew, and I ordered it. It is in transit.
Yeah.
I'm really excited.
Yeah.
And so today we're just going to dig like a little bit deeper into the different stuff surrounding mental health and what certain things are that
Right.
actually happen to be more common than not,
Okay.
like depression, anxiety, addiction, and suicide. So let's get into that. What is depression, anxiety? What's the differences?
So depression is more so, well, each diagnosis is pretty much composed of like a variety of symptoms. So, but for depression, you see more so things like consistent sadness, lack of appetite, lack of motivation, um, things of that nature. And then it has to have been ongoing for at least about 2 weeks consistently
Mm-hmm.
before we start to call it depression, because sometimes we see things where um, obviously transitions, adjustments, those types of situations um, may result in what's called an adjustment disorder, where you may have, obviously your symptoms are a result of you adjusting to a new environment, a new situation, a
Mm-hmm.
present situation. And so you're struggling through that. Whereas like major depressive disorder is like you have to have a certain amount of symptoms in a 2 weeks time frame to be able to qualify for that. Whereas anxiety is more so related, again, a good amount of symptoms. Now, there's a difference between having an anxiety disorder and just having general anxiety, which can look like, overthinking, feeling on edge. Um, it could be accompanied by panic attacks, so hyperventilating, difficulty sleeping, like depression. Depression has like hypersomnia, meaning oversleeping or undersleeping. And so anxiety, you also see like maybe some difficulty sleeping, more so irritability than sadness necessarily. And so typically depression and anxiety we usually see them often together. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so a lot of people like to think of depression as like living too far in the past, and anxiety is like living too far in the future, because obviously when we're anxious we get into this headspace of not being able to either control what's happening or
Right.
able to anticipate what's happening. So those are the two more common diagnoses that I see people with. But like I said, anxiety disorders, there is panic disorder, there is, social anxiety disorder. Anxiety is just kind of like an umbrella, and then there are different things that fall underneath it.
Right. Um, so one of the stigmas surrounding depression, I would say, is like you're just sad, get over it. Um, making it like a choice. And what are the reasons behind, or the scientific evidence that like this is not about somebody having a bad day?
Right, and just being sad. So yes, there is a difference between a state of sadness and then actual depression. What we typically see is, so depression and sometimes even anxiety, it causes an imbalance in the brain. And so pretty much our body creates and emits a chemical called dopamine, and
Mm-hmm.
then another one that's called serotonin. These are neurotransmitters. And so our body naturally produces these things. And so when we aren't producing enough of it, that's when we start to feel more sadness, more general symptoms of depression or anxiety. And so, as we kind of talked about in our last session, like the stigmatization around medications. And so what a medication may help somebody do is, that's the physiological part of helping your body to create more dopamine, which are like happy neurotransmitters. So
Mm-hmm.
those who exercise, you release dopamine. When you have sex, you release dopamine. Like all of these things that kind of bring us pleasure, that's what dopamine is responsible for. And so sometimes chemically we just don't produce enough, and so that's what ends up kind of creating the difference between sadness and depression. Like the sadness or chronic sadness can be a symptom of depression.
Okay. So then we also have addiction. How does addiction tie into the conversation about mental health, tie in, and how it ties into depression? I only recently found out that addiction was considered a mental illness. And when I say recently, maybe in the last year
Yeah.
and a half.
So, addiction is considered to be kind of a disease in its own right. So,
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about how it relates to mental health, is usually when people are struggling with their mental health, they're experiencing uncomfortable or negative symptoms. They want to find a way to cope with it, and addiction becomes an easy way to cope. So, a lot of people may drink, they may smoke, they may do drugs as an effort to numb their emotional and mental pain that they're going through. And so, there are even some mental health diagnoses that have a higher likelihood of accompanying an addiction problem, like people who are bipolar. And that's just because a lot of diagnoses when it comes to mental health, you can see issues with impulse control. And so that's also a component of addiction. Is it's these people have no they eventually don't have a cap. They when most people, they can say, hey, I had 2 drinks, I feel fine, I don't want any more.
Mm-hmm.
These people, they don't have any limits. They have a hard time implementing certain limits around their use. And so what I've typically seen in my work is, when you talk to teenagers about substance abuse, drinking alcohol, smoking weed,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, they'll tell you they do it to have a good time. They'll
Right.
get drunk because it's fun and that's what everybody else is doing. But that's also before a lot of kids have like real problems. And so
Right.
enter into adulthood and we realize the effects, and we start to build a higher tolerance to alcohol or to a different type of drug. It takes more to, number one, give us the same effect. And it all kind of circles back to this idea that usually when people start to use substances as a coping skill, it's because they aren't in a place where they're ready to confront whatever is going on head on.
Right. So what are the approach for treatment for addiction?
So it really depends on severity. We kind of just start with assessing how much is being used. We do a lot of work around triggers, right? So there are certain things that trigger people to use more than other things. It may be a person, a place, situations. Sometimes it can be things like boredom. It can be things like payday. So we really want to explore in what situations does this person find themselves more likely to use. And then again, so there are different levels. So if somebody, let's say, for example, is an alcoholic and they are drinking up to a fifth a day, you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, they may be, depending on the substance, we also may have to have them go in detox in order to
Right.
really give them a jump start on building sobriety. And so
Yeah, because if their body becomes dependent on it, is that become another obstacle in the treatment process?
absolutely. And that's why, some people look at addiction and they're like, oh, it's a choice. Like, if a person wanted to throw away their life and they had the choice not to, but they can't seem to not do that because their usage is putting them in the position of abandoning everything else, that's a chemical and a physical dependency that's happening. And so it's one of those things where, depending on the substance, like alcohol is one of those things where if somebody is heavily using it over an extended period of time, we do not want them to necessarily go cold turkey without any sort of help, because
Mm-hmm.
alcohol is more likely to have withdrawal symptoms that can result in different types of bodily functions going wrong, more than any other substance. And so with alcohol withdrawal, we see people have the shakes, they may have difficulty sleeping. There are a bunch of kind of nasty side effects. It's the same thing with like opiates, right? We hear a lot about during the opiate epidemic, we heard a lot about like what people were experiencing, or in movies or television shows, they kind of show people have a really hard time coming off of opiates. And it's usually because, again, their body is physically dependent on this substance now.
Okay. And then lastly, and I had only picked like four that I knew a little bit about. And then this is it's a short conversation. So we didn't have to go through every single mental illness. But I wanted to talk about suicide surrounding the Black community because it happens, and it's something that I feel like even though like we're starting to address mental health, when it comes to suicide, there's still a very negative and like it's not like a good thing, but I think more so people of like a when someone expresses feeling suicidal and people being like, oh, you want to kill yourself or like just like people's how they approach it, how they address it, and just like why that's dangerous, and stuff like that.
So I think it comes from, for most people, from a genuine place of misunderstanding. Some people see a vocalization of suicidal thoughts or ideations as attention seeking, right? Like, so people may feel like, well, if you really felt that way, why not just do it? Why
Mm-hmm.
line and talk about it, or why vocally express it? And you don't necessarily want to make that assumption because it can be dangerous, right? Like, this may be somebody's last cry for help. And sometimes we do see that happen where it's not that these people are looking for attention, they're looking for help. And this is
Right.
the best way they know how to express it. I think it's also, suicide is a very layered issue as far as assessing it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I often have to assure clients that if I ask them about prior thoughts, feelings about suicide, that them expressing that doesn't mean I'm going to get on the phone and I'm going to admit them to a psychiatric hospital.
Right.
And what stops people from getting help at times is this assumption that, like, oh, if I say anything like that, they can lock me up involuntarily. And that's not the case. A good clinician knows how to kind of judge levels in how they assess the severity of it, right? So there are some people, including myself, who feel like when life gets really tough, you feel like sometimes you just don't want to be here. Sometimes
Right.
you could go for a long sleep. Life
Mm-hmm.
life is hard. And so sometimes when people express things like that, we call that more so passive suicidal ideation, where it's not that this person is ready to go and do it at that moment, but life just feels really heavy for them at
Mm-hmm.
the time. And so sometimes they wish they weren't here, or people internalize maybe negative perceptions that other people have about them. So they may feel like, I think the world would be better off if I wasn't around, sort of
Yeah.
thoughts. And so those we can work with. Like those are we need to more so kind of in a sense like normalize the fact that sometimes life just feels hard and you don't want to do it anymore. But
Right.
that doesn't mean like we have to, when we talk about assessing suicide, we look at, you know, we start there, but then we move into, have you ever had a plan? Have you ever had an attempt? What did that look like? If you did do it, what, you know, so that way we can assess like means and method, right? Like if somebody says, oh, I would shoot myself, but they have no access to a gun, then that makes that method a little harder for them to achieve. You get what I'm saying?
Right.
So we definitely want to, it's not a one size fit all thing. You really want to know how to get a person to open up about where they are in the event that it comes off like, oh, this person might be suicidal. So really just exploring what that looks like for them, because it isn't always like I'm ready to go do this, and most people aren't in that place yet. You know, if they're talking about it, they haven't reached the point where they're ready to go do it.
Right.
Because when people actually do commit suicide, a lot of the times we hear that their loved ones didn't see it coming. They
Right.
that they had certain struggles, but when people are really committed to that, just because that's their decision to make, you don't get a lot of talk around it.
Yeah. And it's definitely something that I think, because it's such a hard, it's a hard conversation. I know, like, even with people's like personal experiences and stuff like that, like they get upset when they lose that loved one, and
Mm-hmm.
so and they just have to like get an understanding of like, you know, why am I upset about this? Which is like, yeah, you lost someone, and then like sometimes like we do wish, like I wish there was something I could do, because like they don't see it.
Right.
And I think that's another contributing factor to the negative response to stuff like that, because it feels like we could have stopped this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And what most people don't realize is like we're even changing the language around suicide. So instead of saying like somebody died by suicide, people usually die from depression, and the
Mm-hmm.
suicide was a means to stop that depression. Um,
Right.
Not that usually people wake up one day and decide that they're just going to, you know, remove themselves from this earth. There is usually and typically a buildup. And so it is important for us to continue to kind of create safe spaces for people to be able to express when they're struggling and help them get certain resources.
Right. So then, lastly, what are some solutions? Are these things like preventable, or is it kind of like a just having good practices in your everyday life to stay in good headspace, stuff like that?
So are you more so asking about like depression or anxiety or suicide being preventable, or like?
I'd say just kind of like it's for mental health solutions. It was like therapy, exercise, perspective, education, and understanding.
Yes. So those are all really good places to start, is just the way we kind of manage our physical body. We go to the doctor, we go to the dentist, we go to the OB-GYN when we need to, you know. We have to kind of think of our mental health the same. So how do I go about managing it? People get really surprised when I tell them how long I've been in therapy, which has been for about 6 years at this point. And I've been in therapy that long because I look at my therapy as an integrated part of my health. So
Mm-hmm.
just as just because, you know, just the same way that I make time and effort to make sure that I'm physically okay, I know that due to my own struggles with mental health, I need to always keep an opening to be able to make sure that I'm in the best headspace that I can be. And if I'm
Right.
good headspace, I have a good space where I can go and work that out, and of how to kind of get back into the flow of where I need to be. And so I know that sometimes finding therapy or finding a good therapist is not always, it's easier said than done. And so I always
Mm-hmm.
encourage people to kind of just reach out to their network. Social media is a great tool I can't tell you how many therapist pages I've sent to just random people who DM'd me asking for referrals. But making sure that you're prepared to do the work as well, right? Like making
Right.
sure that you're follow up, that you're prepared and committed to keeping your appointments, to coming into that appointment with something, and then understanding that it's so things will adjust. So just because you start therapy doesn't mean that you're going to go every week for the rest of your life. Like there have been periods of time where I was in therapy every week, I was in therapy every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, once a month,
Right.
based on my life and what I needed at that moment. But I always at some point needed and continued those check-ins because that space, I had learned how valuable it was for me in being able to work through my own stuff because I work with other people's stuff. So I have to
Right.
make sure that I'm on top of my own mental health and emotional wellness. And so you mentioned exercise. That's also a great way, like we talked about that dopamine, making sure that you're doing things on a day-to-day basis that bring you some sort of enjoyment, happiness, contentment, right? So that way it doesn't feel like we go so long without doing things that feel good or meaningful. Self-care, like that looks a bunch of different ways, but just making sure that if you want to be in a really good headspace in regards to your mental health and your emotions, that you're doing your due diligence.
Right. Right. And they say 30 days makes a habit, 90 days makes a lifestyle.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can't just expect things to happen or get better. And as Black people, sometimes we use resiliency as a coping skill, right? Like,
Mhm.
oh, this is what it is, or I just keep pushing through. And it's like
Right.
at a certain point, we we can't lean on that all the time because we need to give ourselves permission to be weak at moments. We need to give
Right.
ourselves and to let our guards down, let our defense mechanisms down, and to really heal because healing doesn't come out of avoidance. It doesn't come out of denial. It doesn't come out of um, resiliency. It comes out of being intentional with doing the work and being self aware of what your own stuff is.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, that's all that I have. Thank you again so much. Just for the last week and this week and sharing that information. It's definitely information that people need in the Black community. I still have conversations. I was just like, depression is not like, they're like, oh, people have been through worse. I'm like, it's not about who's been through worse, because
Absolutely.
my life, the worst thing that happened to me today is the worst thing that happened to me today.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm not thinking about, some like, like there's always someone going to be at a different place than we are. And when it comes to mental health, just as a community, like we have to be there for each other and become more understanding. Therapy and other demographics and classes and lifestyles is normalized, from a young age. And for the Black community, it's just so important for us to be able to have that. Like I don't remember if it was you last week when you had said about Twitter, about how like people are like, oh, like that happened to me too, like
Right.
just
Universal
having.
that you're not
Yeah.
the dealing with something.
Yeah. So thank you again. You want to give your closing remarks, where to find you, be the change. Are you accepting new clients, stuff like that?
So right now I'm not accepting new clients. I need to, my schedule is a bit all over the place. I may have some openings, towards the end of September. As far as finding me or connecting with me, my Instagram at Be The Change TS, is a good place to start. I'm always open to responding to, DMs, questions, engaging with my content. I try to put a lot of mental health related things up there. And then of course I just released my book. The link is in the bio of my Instagram. That is pretty much therapy without having to go. It is a compilation of what I believe to be the most important mental and emotional concepts that we need to learn and to apply and understand, to be our best selves as adults right now.
So thank you so much. Make sure you guys follow Brittany, get the book. I'm really excited to read it because, like you said, that type of material don't exist, and then it's written by a Black woman, and so it's just to have that, like somebody else is here for that. And so, and thank you for doing the work because we need it. And you are just doing a wonderful job, and so thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. And you continue to put out great content that
Thank
needs.
you. So make sure you guys check out last episode if you didn't see it, and have a wonderful night.
Right.
Good night.